Good morning and welcome back to the Morning Endurance Call. I'm Keith Erwood, and this is a free daily 15-minute or less leadership ritual for business owners, executives, and preparedness professionals who want to build stronger businesses, think more clearly under pressure, and lead with more clarity in uncertain times. Each weekday morning, we spend a few minutes talking about what it really takes to build stronger businesses, stronger leadership, and stronger preparedness in a world where disruption is part of reality. Today's topic is this: a business impact analysis is not just a form-filling exercise. This matters because one of the biggest reasons BIAs lose value inside organizations is that it gets treated like an administrative requirement instead of a strategic business tool. People fill out questionnaires, departments answer prompts, templates get completed, spreadsheets get updated, documents get filed away. And on the surface, it can look like progress. But if the process does not improve clarity, prioritization, and leadership decision making, then a lot of activity may have occurred without enough value being created. That is the real issue. Because a BIA should not exist merely to collect information. A BIA should exist to help the organization understand what matters most, what the business cannot afford to lose for long, what consequences disruption would create, and what that means for preparedness, recovery, and leadership priorities. That is not paperwork. That is strategic insight. And that is why I say a BIA is not just a form-filling exercise. At its best, a BIA helps answer very practical and very important business questions. What functions are truly critical? How long can those functions be disrupted before consequences become serious? What operational, financial, customer, regulatory, or reputational effects would follow? What dependencies make those functions possible? What recovery priorities should be shaped by that information? Those are leadership questions. They are not just continuity questions. They are not just compliance questions. They are business questions. And when a business impact analysis is handled well, it gives leadership better visibility into the consequences of disruption. That matters because organizations often talk generally about importance. They'll say things like, this process is important, that system matters, this team is critical, and that vendor is essential. But a strong BIA moves the conversation from general importance to structured consequence. It helps the business say, this function affects revenue within this time frame. This dependency would create operational issues if unavailable. This process has this process has customer, compliance, and financial implications. This outage threshold is unacceptable. This recovery order needs to reflect actual business consequence. That is a very different level of clarity. And this is where the strategic value of the BIA begins. Because once consequence becomes clearer, better decisions become possible. Leadership can allocate resources more intelligently. Recovery priorities become more credible. And preparedness discussions become more focused. Assumptions get challenged, gaps become easier to see, and investments become easier to justify. That is why a BIA matters. Not because it creates documentation, but because it creates business clarity and understanding. Now, let me make an important distinction. A BIA is not the same thing as a risk assessment. A risk assessment helps the organization look broadly at what could disrupt it. A BIA helps the organization look more deeply at what the consequences would be if disruption affects specific business functions. Both matter, but they do different work. Risk assessment helps you see exposure. BIA helps you understand the consequence. That is one of the reasons BIAs are so valuable for leadership. They bring consequence into clearer focus. And this matters because many businesses are carrying hidden assumptions about what is critical, how long disruption is tolerable, and what should come back first. Those assumptions may sound reasonable until the organization is under pressure. Then suddenly, differences emerge. One department thinks it needs immediate recovery. Another believes it can wait. Leadership assumes a process is recoverable manually. Operations knows that assumption is weak. Technology thinks an application is the priority. The business says the real issue is the process behind it. That is exactly the kind of confusion a good BIA is meant to reduce. It helps create shared clarity and understanding. And shared understanding is one of the most valuable things a business can have before disruption occurs. So let's make this more practical. What happens when a BIA gets treated as just a form-filling exercise? A few things usually go wrong. First, people answer quickly without enough reflection. They fill in fields, they estimate loosely, they use generic language, they provide incomplete dependency information. They overstate criticality or understate consequence because the conversation never really goes deep enough. Second, the process becomes too disconnected from leadership use. The information gets collected, but it does not get translated into decisions. It does not shape recovery priorities. It does not change strategy. It does not influence testing. And it does not sharpen continuity thinking. So the document exists, but the capability does not strengthen enough. Third, the BIA may become too theoretical. Instead of describing how the business really functions, it describes an idealized or incomplete picture. And when that happens, the organization may believe it understands impact better than it actually does. That is dangerous, because false clarity can be more damaging than acknowledged uncertainty. And fourth, the exercise may miss the real value entirely. The real value of a BIA is not merely the completed template. The real value is the thinking, the discussion, the challenge, the prioritization, and the business insight it creates. That is what leaders should care about. This is why a good BIA process often feels less like paperwork and more like a facilitated business analysis. It involves asking better questions. Not just, what does your department do? But, what happens if this function is unavailable? How quickly would the consequences become serious? And what dependencies make this possible? What workarounds exist? What assumptions are we making? What would leadership need to understand about this impact? And what would happen downstream if this function failed? Those are better questions. and better questions produce better preparedness. This also connects directly to financial impact, because eventually many business leaders want to understand not just that a disruption is bad, but what it means in operational and financial terms. That is where the BIA becomes extremely useful. It helps establish why something matters, how quickly it matters, and where the business may be more exposed than leaders realize. That creates a stronger foundation for recovery strategy, continuity planning, staffing decisions, escalation thinking, investment prioritization, and executive conversation. That is strategic value. And this connects directly to endurance. Because endurance in business is the ability to continue operating, make sound decisions, recover intelligently, and keep moving forward under pressure over time. A strong BIA supports endurance because it helps the business understand what must be protected, what must be restored, what the real consequences are, and where leadership attention belongs before disruption puts those questions to the test. Without that clarity, recovery becomes less focused, decision-making becomes weaker, preparedness becomes more generic, and the business becomes more vulnerable to confusion. But when a BIA is done well, the organization becomes more grounded in reality. It understands what matters most, it sees impact more clearly, and it can prepare more deliberately. That is what endurance requires. Now, I want to say something important for leaders. You do not need to become a BIA specialist to value the BIA. But what you do need to understand is what good BIA work should give you. It should give you better visibility into critical business functions, impact timeframes, dependency relationships, recovery priorities, and consequence severity. It should help answer what can we not afford to lose, for how long, what happens if we do, and what does that mean for how we prepare. If your current BIA process is not improving those conversations, then it may need to be strengthened. That is not a criticism, it is an opportunity, because a stronger BIA process can improve much more than documentation. It can improve recovery thinking, it can improve cross-functional understanding, it can improve executive confidence, it can improve the quality of preparedness investments, and it can help the business become less fragile when disruption shows up. That is the goal. So here's a practical test. Ask yourself, does our BIA process create real clarity about critical functions and consequences? Or does it mostly produce completed forms? That question reveals a lot, because the finished document is not the ultimate measure of success. The real measure is whether the business understands itself better because of the process. That is the standard. And here's today's leadership takeaway. A strong BIA is not about completing templates. It is about creating the business clarity that makes it better. Preparedness, better recovery, and better decisions possible. That is why it matters. And here's today's question for you. Does your BIA process produce forms, or does it produce strategic clarity and understanding? That is the leadership question. Because when disruption happens, it is not the form that protects the business. It is the clarity the business gained from the process. Thank you for joining me today on the Morning Endurance Call. If this kind of thinking is useful to you, join the free endurance community. That is where I'm sharing additional resources, tools, live learning, and ongoing conversations for business owners, executives, and practitioners who want to build stronger businesses through preparedness, leadership, and endurance. The link is in the description below. Tomorrow, we'll talk about what leaders usually miss about critical functions, because not everything important is equally critical. And that distinction matters more than many people realize. Until then, think clearly, prepare deliberately, lead with endurance. Thanks for joining. Bye now.